Welcome. Thank you all for joining us tonight. It's a pleasure to be here in First Congregational Church. It's an honor to be gathered in this beautiful space and to share in this congregation's long history of pursuing understanding through collective dialogue and education. I want to extend a heartfelt thanks to the leadership of First Congregational who helped us put together this event, to Reverend Leanne Bryce, Reverend Josh Rumpel, to Emily Bond, and especially to Rachel Rumpel, whose expert advice and presence here tonight helps us put together this event. Thank you very much. I must also thank the Henry Luce Foundation, whose generous support has helped found the Center for the Study of Evangelicalism here at the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs, and also inaugurate this lecture series on cultures of evangelicalism, past and present. I always wish to recognize our director, Jeffrey Scholes, as well as our associate directors, Paul Harvey and George Bayuga, somewhere in the room, whose presence at the forum yesterday in this very church helped us see why this center is so needed in this moment in our nation's history, as we seek to understand it and invest in the hard work of collective memory and knowledge production that will help us know this moment better for future generations to come. Now more than ever, we need the resources, tools, and infrastructures of understanding that scholarship provides and our community helps to furnish. I wish to recognize the incredible generosity of our community, including an anonymous, amazing matching donation of $15,000 that we invite you to help realize by sharing whatever gift, no matter how small, to help us ensure the center and its work can continue for generations to come. Now it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our speaker for this evening, who's joining us from New Haven, Connecticut, Professor Todne Thomas, Associate Professor of Divinity and Religious Studies at Yale University. Professor Thomas's ethnographic collaboration with Afro-Caribbean and African-American congregants has shaped her scholarship on the racial, spatial, and familial dynamics of Black Christian communities. Her scholarship and teaching explore intersectional constructions of power, as well as critical forms of consciousness and practice that attend modalities of the sacred and explore contemporary formations of Black evangelicalism. Thomas's first book, Kincraft, The Making of Black Evangelical Sociality, locates a Black evangelical community at the center of their own religious story, presenting their determined spiritual relatedness as a form of insurgency. The book argues that Kincraft, how church members construct one another as brothers and sisters in Christ, animates community life and traces diasporic and religious antecedents to Black evangelical kin-making, which helps to understand how spiritual kincraft can be mobilized against normative, denominational, nuclear family, and ethno-racial exclusions within U.S. evangelicalism. Professor Thomas is also currently in the process of completing a forthcoming book, From Hate to Hallows, Reframing Black Church Arson, which examines the burning of a predominantly Black Seventh-day Adventist church in Knoxville, Tennessee in 2015. She argues Black church arson is an interpretive phenomenon that is best apprehended through local explanatory frameworks of religion, race, and hallowed ground. Please join me in welcoming Professor Todne Thomas.
Thank you. Good evening. Can you hear me? Okay. Thumbs up. Awesome. All right. Well, I would like to begin by just saying I wish I could be there with you. Mother Nature had other plans. Nonetheless, it's an honor to be with you in a digital way. And I'd like to thank George Bayuga and Ben Slidham for the invitation to be in conversation with you tonight. Let's do this. Are we ready? We're going to put our hands up. I'm still a teacher, right? Yeah, all right, great. So the title of my talk is Spiritual Relations in Hallowed Ground. To begin our discussion, I'd like to open with the scripture to help us get into the mode of imagining sacred relations in space. Psalm 18:19, and I read from the New International Version. Quote, "He brought me into a spacious place. He rescued me because he delighted in me." A friend of mine who knows how much I adore Harriet Tubman recited this verse to me often when we talked during the pandemic, speaking of open spaces and the need, right? In some readings, she would change the word he to she. In that way, I can imagine Harriet or God in another form, and in being in a space of communion with the Creator themselves. Rescue, then space, and then a field of sacred relations. In the time I spent with the Black evangelical community in Atlanta, I'm reminded of how excited members would get when they sang the popular ballad, I Am a Friend of God. People would get up off their feet, elders would have their hands pumping in the air. And I'm reminded that communion with God and communion about God with kith and kin creates special spaces of connection. We'll explore some of these a bit later. There's another text I'd like to share with you to also continue our meditations, this time about hallowed ground. It's an excerpt from poem number 6 from Bell Hooks's Appalachian Elegy, and I read it here. All the holy ones embracing us, all our kin, making home here, renegade, marooned, lawless fugitives grace these mountains. We have earth to bind us the covenant between us can never be broken, vows to live and let live. We are reminded that spaces are rarely new. Settler colonialism lies. We have and are always in a field of relations. We share our spaces knowingly and unknowingly with those who come before us, the holy ones, the kin, maroons, and even lawless fugitives. Hooks's poetry is set in the Appalachia of her native Kentucky. I'm just one state down from Tennessee. It elegantly reminds us that spaces are hallowed because they've been inhabited. Who knows where angels have dared to tread? This talk comes from both of my book projects. The first, Kincraft, which Ben did a great job summarizing. And the second is a book that's forthcoming for next year about a Black Church Arson in Knoxville, Tennessee, my hometown, which occurred in 2015. First, we'll learn about Black evangelical spiritual kinship and one space of everyday relationship forged by church sisters. Second, we'll explore an extra-church context of hallowed ground and a thing that threatens to profane it, capitalist development. Together, both scenes illustrate the labor involved in creating and commemorating sacred relationships and spaces, in particular, the craftswomanship of Black women. Both scenes also demonstrate the significance of such spaces of belonging amidst the alienations of racism, the mobilities of immigration, and the displacements of urban renewal and white supremacist violence. We are hopefully left with expanded notions and what I hope will be fruitful questions about kinship, sacred relation and space, and what the church is and where it might be. All right, are we ready to dig in? Hands? All right, let's do this. Okay. Home places and yard spaces. So Kincraft was my first ethnographic journey, right? It's set in two Caribbean and African-American evangelical congregations that I name. I use pseudonyms for the congregations, Dixon Bible Chapel and Corinthian Bible Chapel, right? And these fellowships descend from Plymouth Brethrenism, which is a particular branch of evangelicalism, right? There are some evangelicals like Tom Skinner who had time with the Brethren, one of the founders of this movement, who I don't think has gotten his roses or enough historical documentation is T. Michael Flowers, who's an Afro-Bahamian missionary that comes to the South to do missionary work. He comes to the Bible Belt to do missionary work in the 1950s. It's an amazing history. I'm trying to think of other famous brethren. Of course, John Nelson Darby is probably one of the most famous brethren that we know. So these two sort of brethren, Black evangelical churches set in Atlanta, enjoy what I understood to be a very dense, multi-layered religious belonging, right? That was highly mediated by notions of spiritual kinship. So what do I mean by spiritual kinship? By spiritual kinship, I mean relationships that church members in Atlanta co-produced as, and these are their terms, brothers and sisters in Christ, spiritual mothers, spiritual fathers, spiritual children, and prayer partners, right? So hopefully, do some of these terms sound familiar to some people? Do people have some prayer partners, some church brothers and sisters out there? Some spiritual parents and spiritual mothers? Um, and more than just terminology, these relationships manifested through an insistence on discourse, right? One of the first times I met a church member, I introduced myself as Todne. And he said, well, it's Sister Todne, right? Because you're a Christian, right? I was corrected like my first day in the fellowship. But it's also manifested through shared practices and rituals, right? It's through a literalist biblical hermeneutic, right? If the Bible says you're brothers and sisters in Christ, you are brothers and sisters in Christ, right? This is something that I heard often. It's fostered through universalistic notions of ecumenicalism, right? Being concerned with the universal church and the universal family of God. It was fostered through, once again, the insistence on using kin-based language. Like it was always sister this, brother that. Bare names were almost never used, actually. It was fostered through breaking of bread service, right, which brethren do every Sunday. It was fostered through confessional intimacies where people share their weaknesses, their vulnerabilities, their shortcomings in the faith. And this was a particular act of intimacy because certain kinds of mental transgression could get you read out of fellowship, right? So who do you trust with your stuff, right? Your deep stuff, right? Your intimate stuff, your transgressions even. And finally, as we'll discuss very, very soon, this kinship, spiritual kinship was created through the sharing of food on and between Sundays, right? So thinking of spiritual kinship, the reason why the study of Black evangelical spiritual kinship, and I would say there's a reason why we need to study evangelical spiritual kinship and kinship making more broadly, it's important is because all too often, I think, forms of U.S. evangelicalism are understood through the heteronormative family, right? Like evangelicalism becomes equated with nuclear family values, right? And at least the Black evangelicals in Atlanta that I spent over a year talking with, worshiping with, interviewing, did not solely focus their attention on creating the nuclear family. And that's not to say that that's not important. It certainly was. But Black evangelicals at CBC and DBC also used their spiritual relationships as a mode of kincraft, right? That really understood the Christian faith to be a highly social faith, right? But one of the ways in which you were a Christian was not just about your devotion, your relationship to God, but your devotion and your relationship to spiritual kin, right? And the ways in which you would, as they called it, come alongside your spiritual kin in your life and beyond. It also is very important because spiritual kinship helped people create forms of communion as they dealt with racialization, the social dislocations of immigration. Immigration is very disruptive socially, right, to your social network, and forms of social and economic mobility, right? I did my research in 2008, and that was the height of the Great Recession. So there was a real form of economic exchange and support amongst members that were happening during that time as the subprime mortgage bubble burst, and Atlanta was a huge site for that. So more often than not, an institutional view of evangelical relatedness can foreground men's roles as the primary mediators of biblical knowledge or the overseers of church affairs. However, this overlooks an important set of relationships and spiritual processes that reinforces church fellowship, that of church women. Moreover, exclusive attention to formal church programming, right, also overlooks the myriad contributions that women make to their community and to the production of spiritual kinship. Although church doctrines and practices prevented CBC and DBC women from holding official leadership positions, they offered their presence, time, spiritual and material resources to the DBC community daily. They crafted relationships in and across households. right, such as prayer partnerships and spiritual mothering ties that infused a sense of intimacy and familialism into community sociality. DBC women understood sisterhood as a category of relationship that was built on their shared identity as Christian women and as church members. But unlike church brotherhood, which served very much a role in institutional framework for church governance, sisterhood was not explicitly outlined in institutional doctrines or reified through Bible study or exegesis. So in this church, only men could preach, right? There was no such thing as a formal pastor. Brethren believe in like the democratic sharing of exegesis amongst men, right? So brotherhood was not exclusively just about text, but it was very much institutionally mediating exegesis in this community, right? And sisterhood doesn't do that, but it does other work. So sisterhood emerged as a form of relatedness anchored in rituals of nourishing and experiences that fostered a sense of camaraderie among church women. Church sisters, even when performing traditional women's work, produced their own valuable form of community by bringing vestiges of the home into the church and of the church into the home. Bell Hooks offers us a concept of home place that helps us understand the significance of this. According to Hooks, home place are spaces of care and nurturance in the face of harsh reality of racist oppression, where all Black people could strive to be subjects, not objects, where we could be affirmed in our minds and our hearts despite poverty, hardship, and deprivation, where we could restore to ourselves the dignity denied us on the outside in the public world. This task of making home place was not simply a matter of Black women providing service. It was about the construction of a safe place where Black people could affirm one another and by doing so heal many of the wounds inflicted by racist domination. Hooks' outlook on Black women's domesticity sidesteps explanations that frame Black women's domestic labor as the product of naturalized gender differences. Her emphasis on the type of social space cultivated by Black women also evades mischaracterizations of Black women's relationship to the household as a pathological emasculating matriarchy. Rather than trying to restrict Black domestic spaces and women's relationship to those spaces, Hooks concerns herself with the internal textures of Black domestic lives. She primarily depicts Black home places as spaces of care and nurturance, which we'll see also applies to the work done by Black evangelicals in Atlanta. To be sure, the home places of DBC women experienced their provision of material and spiritual resources. Initially, it was a Jamaican non-church member living in the Atlanta area who explained to me the connection between home and food sharing. When I asked her how she defined family, which was one of my favorite questions to ask people, still is, Anne Marume responded that, quote, family and home was where you can get your rice and peas, where you can visit without calling first, unquote. And I thought this was really interesting because there were a couple of couples that adopted me while I was doing my field work. And one of them was a Trinidadian man and an African-American wife. And I would call before I came over. And it took about 6 months before I would stop. My church father would get so annoyed that I kept calling. I was like, well, I can't just drop by. He's like, yes, you can. Yes, you can. You can just drop by. And I was like, no, I don't want to come by without being in. He's like, you can. You just knock on the door. I was like, well, what if you're not home? He's like, then you don't get inside, right? So, where can you go? Where can you show up and not call? This was like what we call an emic discourse, an emic definition of kinship and family. But rice and peas, right? Whose rice and peas do you trust? Also, right, a statement of kinship and relationship. For Marume, as well as DBC members, opening up what's home for visiting and sharing meals is an important way in which Afro-Caribbeans create belonging. It follows then that noting who eats and cooks with one another is a useful way of gauging which persons and spaces are engaged in creating relatedness. And this is something that I'd ask you to mull over, right? Who do you eat and cook with, right? Who do you break bread with, to use the vernacular phrase? By creating and embodying shared substances in the kitchen, Afro-Caribbean and African-American church women occupy important social and spatial locations for kin making. So connected to the domestic analysis evoked by Hooks' concept of home place, are Afro-Caribbean understandings of the yard, right? And the yard is a site for family and community meeting. It's not just like a literal yard like that's fenced in. It's within Caribbean context, yards are spaces between homes shared by local neighbors. Like think of like an alleyway or small pathways between homes. They're typically distinguished from public streets, and they're common spaces. So yards are inter-household contexts in which family and community ties are incorporated as members gather and witness the ebb and flow of everyday life. With familiarity fostered by the sharing of space and experiences comes the collaboration, even the conflict that punctuate persons' cohabitation in shared social worlds. In yard spaces, community members convene to chat, exchange pleasantries, gossip, quips, to hang out, to borrow things from one another, to study the Bible, and more. There are also quite a few Jesus jokes. Yards are interstitial spaces in which communal collectivism and identifications are produced and seasoned. Essentially, they're junctures at which family, extended family, and community relations figuratively and literally meet. This is not to be confused with just the entertaining visits of bourgeois domesticity. The production of yard spaces is less about the performance of respectable womanhood and more about the enjoyment of everyday connection. At first glance, the urban sprawl of the Atlanta metro area makes the intimacy and spatial proximity of Caribbean yards appear a distant memory. Has anyone ever been to Atlanta? It is, I'm telling you, very challenging place to do field work. It has a tiny inner city core. It is a city of small towns, right? So it is a highly decentralized city spatially, right? Moreover, Atlanta's suburban arrangements of domiciles as separate units surrounded by private lawns and demarcated by gated areas evokes the very opposite of the inter-household intersections that organize Caribbean yards, right? As a group, DBC members live in a variety of counties within and around Atlanta. I was driving around as a grad student. I got the first generation of GPS to do my field work, which is thankful because I was terrible with maps and was lost very often in my pre-field work. My father was very nervous about having his daughter, a 26-year-old daughter, driving around Atlanta lost. And so although there is this very decentralized nature of the city, and there's the kind of atomization of domestic life based off of the suburban design, church, cell group members, and informal enclaves of members still managed to form proximal and neighborly ties with one another. So there would be certain neighborhoods where 3 or 4 families would concentrate, and they would have these everyday, more quotidian units of gathering, right? Groups of church members who live in the same or neighboring housing areas in Decatur or Stone Mountain, for instance, not only stop by for informal visits, but also gather to socialize quite regularly. So I give you one scene of the home place / yard space. One Friday night, I attended one of these gatherings hosted by the Marshalls, a middle-aged Jamaican couple who were relatively new to the DBC community at the time of my research. As I entered their modest, well-furnished suburban home, the smell of curry goat stew cooked by Sister Marshall mingled with the sound of Caribbean gospel playing in the kitchen. Occasionally, loud jokes and protests uttered by DBC men playing dominoes in the basement game room made their way up the stairs. I just want you to notice that the women are upstairs and the men are downstairs. So we have space being gendered here, right? As I was explicitly invited by Brother Marshall to keep Sister Marshall company, I made myself comfortable in the kitchen area. Fine by me, I was closer to the food. Talking with her while she finished her stew. Although she and her husband were relatively new to the faith, I learned that they frequently hosted such gatherings. Over time, I gleaned that Sister Francine Marshall and her husband, Delroy, had garnered a reputation among the community for their hospitality and their open home. And throughout my time in Georgia, I experienced this hospitality many times. She had the best Jamaican black cake of the entire church community. So got to say, that was not one of the hardships of my research in Atlanta. During the course of the Marshalls Friday night gatherings, the recuperative offerings of home place and the familiarity of the yard converged. The desire for everyday connection and enjoyment of community embeddedness were both experienced there. The Marshalls engineered a space in which church members, as part of a diasporic community, some people had moved once and even twice from their Caribbean homelands to find their way to Atlanta, could experience Christian fellowship and Caribbean notions of home. Over the course of that night, home smells, tastes, sounds, language, and play converged. Rather than remaining a faraway location, they not only invoked home, but they also transformed it into a sensory experience. More than a religious affair, communion was an expression of common identification. More than an obligation, it was a pleasure. Not just church practice endorsed by precedent, but a shared desire for a return home experienced by a familial community. In unpacking the conceptual space of home with which DBC women such as Sister Marshall are closely associated, the material elements, the sensory and symbolic space of home and church converge. Okay, we're rounding the corner. In the summer of 2015, the College Hill Seventh-day Adventist Church community in Knoxville, Tennessee was burned. This occurred several days after the murder of the Emmanuel 9 in Charleston, South Carolina. Bales of hay were set next to the church and set alight. The church fan was also burned. And although church members were able to make quick renovations and return to their church services relatively quickly, no arsonist was ever apprehended. So I wanted to move to a scene of my research. I did research from the summer of 2016 until the summer of 2022, asking people, who do you think did it, right? Looking at local interpretations. So this scene comes from the summer of 2019. I attended a Wednesday evening Bible study at College Hill. Set in the fellowship hall, the program began with an opening prayer and the singing of a hymn very related to our current discussion, Higher Ground. The attendees sang the first verse, I'm pressing on the upward way, new heights I'm gaining every day. Still praying as I'm onward bound, Lord, plant my feet on higher ground. Later in the service, 3 days later, I returned to College Hill for the Sabbath day service on Saturday. And the theme of ground recurred again in our singing, right? This seems like very deep foreshadowing for my summer of research. The opening worship hymn sung sincerely, if not quietly, by a small praise and worship team was, We Are Standing on Holy Ground. The first stanza of that hymn presents an image of assured habitation of sacred space. We are standing on holy ground, and I know there are angels all around. Let us praise Jesus Christ, for we are standing in his presence on holy ground. During my research, I learned that college members associated capitalist development with the potential arson of their church and its afterlife. Needless to say, I was quite surprised by this revelation. The first time I heard about this connection actually occurred at the very end of my first summer of research in 2016. And I will share a set of reflections by one of the church members who discussed this to me. So this is Michael Terrence, which is the pseudonym. So Michael Terrence is talking to me. He said, I had a member of him at my last church say, how are you doing? All right. Now, yeah, okay. When you get off the freeway, what do you see to your right? I said, UT in downtown. He said, and what's to your left? I said, my church. There you go. See, anybody offer you any property these days? He laughs in exchange. And I said, no. And he said, well, don't be surprised if they do. And that's a former member. Called me to see how I was doing after the arson and just made that statement. Don't be surprised if you get offered. They might offer you much bigger spots somewhere out someplace. And we'll just take that off your hands, he said. I told him, we're not selling this spot. It's the best spot in the city. We're not selling this spot. We're in the center of everything. We're not east, we're not west, we're not north, we're not south. Knoxville, we sit in the middle of the city. As Terrence and the church member with whom he was conversing during the interview, there's a member coming in and out of the interview, acknowledged the location of College Hill in the center of the city makes it a coveted location. but one community's sacred ground can be another community's commodity. The closest and most commonly referenced capitalist process that emerged in conversations about capitalism and the church arson was the Hope 6 redevelopment project that happened in the 1990s that was responsible for the demolition of the College Homes housing project that used to stand near the College Hill Church in the broader Mechanicsville community. I believe, and this is where evangelicalism enters into the second part of the group chat here, friends, that there is a revivalist and one might say evangelical ethos contained in development language locally, right? And I don't think it's my job, but I would love for a very eager graduate student to look at this. In particular, I propose that there is a revivalist ethos contained in redevelopment language. Like when you look at this language and study it rhetorically, the promise of the and redevelopment and the speculative aspirations it references has imaginative implications and effective valences of hope, the Hope 6 project. To be sure, speculation is a controversial dimension of capitalism. It's associated with a number of unstable phenomena, like panics, foundering banks, ruined families, irrationality, incalculable decisions, gambling fever, and bewitching brokers. But my attention to the revivalist hope of speculation at play locally, it's not meant to redeem the negative effects of capitalist speculation. Rather, I really hope that we can all turn our attention to the ways in which revivalistic language, right? Like it's the re of revival, it's the re of rebirth. This should sound very similar to some of the promise of Christianity, right? What we should turn our attention to is the revivalistic and conversionary tenor of local redevelopment language, right? That connects some of the discursive features of Christianity, I believe, with the aspirational reach of capitalist processes. The Mechanicsville Report, published in 1999, construed neighborhood redevelopment as a set of spatial transitions that would have aesthetic, utilitarian, economic, and safety implications. And I just want to talk about some of the language. So some of the words that were used were revitalization, redevelopment, reinvestment, rehabilitation, right? So we have 4 words in one sentence that's used. And the language has a kind of soteriological promise, one that is expressed with evangelistic zeal when you read the whole report. So in response to this, or alongside this and concurrent with this redevelopment language that had been applied to the College Hill community in the 1990s. So this arson is happening in 2015, but we have redevelopment language that had been applied to the community preceding the arson, right? So we have a space that's being constructed by different languages, right, at the same time, right, by different community members. While tarrying in the fellowship hall in the summer of 2019, so I'm gone from 2019 to 2016 to the 1990s, back to 2019. I had an engaging conversation with a senior woman and her 2 daughters. After I introduced myself and my interest in studying the church burning, one daughter named Lavetta, a stylishly dressed African-American woman with light-colored skin and a blonde braided updo, mentioned that she'd be interested in conducting an interview. Her sister, Sally Johnson, another light-skinned Black woman with long, wavy, dark brown hair who was wearing a button-up shirt and a plain long skirt, began expressing her opinions on the spot. So she didn't even want to wait to the interview. She had opinions and she was ready to express them then and there. And that, my friends, is like ethnography gold, right? Sally Johnson, who was ready to express herself then and there, had a very decisively spatial view of the arson and the neighborhood community in which she had grown up. So Sally told me that she was one of the first people to alert the local media to the church burning because she lived in the neighborhood. And she contextualized the arson as a misapprehension of the College Hill landscape. This is Sally Johnson speaking directly. The real problem is that the arsonists didn't understand the history of our land. The land that the College Hill community rests upon is hallowed ground. Before the church was built, a Black orphanage stood here. As a child, I was a resident of Mechanicsville housing projects here in College Hill. When Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King was shot, we had to show ID cards just to get past the police to our homes because there were so many riots. And so I did what any curious person would do. I fact checked, and all of those things were true, right? According to Johnson, an arsonist, whether a white supremacist or a person working with capitalist motivations, operated under a misinterpretation of Black sacred space. Rather than depicting the church burning as just the destruction of a religious edifice, Johnson located the church arson within a broader set of changes to a Southern Black urban landscape, a landscape she defined as sacred because of its historical significance to the Black community. Johnson's narrative about the College Hill grounds and the Mechanicsville neighborhood is tinged with the geographic nostalgia that often attends experiences of displacement. According to Hermanjanini Gupta and Kaveri Madappa, residents that witness urban transitions not only make and unmake the space of the grounds in each telling, they also make affective or emotional landscapes. They create emotional narratives lodged between the past of the commons and the privatization of the present. It is through these narratives and effective practices that people create a home in a city, and they craft spaces of belonging. Johnson's hallowed geography creates an effective mode of habitation. The Hallows that Johnson describes to us is a Black nexus of determination, self-sufficiency, and communal care and witness. It's the church, it's the orphanage, it's the housing project, and I'd also add there's a historical Black college in Mechanicsville that closed 5 days before the burning happened as well, which people also found to be a bit suspicious. Though the hallowed ground that was partially mediated by the College Hill building and grounds was misrecognized by the arsonist, according to Johnson, her narrative holds emotional valences of pride and vigilance. The storied Our Land she depicts was worth telling, all of it, before the interview. It told of this College Hill community and its antecedents, and one might even imagine its descendants. The storied Our Land was worth preserving, and this Johnson did through her narrative. This emotional posture seems to me less rooted in nostalgia than a desire to instantiate a claim to space, a narrative ward, if you will, to ward against modes of displacement that are fast, like the church burning, or slower, like the violence of urban redevelopment. I propose that Johnson maps a hallowed commons, a neighborhood geography and history in which College Hill is ensconced, and it sacralizes Black community persistence. So this evening, we have traveled from scripture to poem, from Black evangelicals in Atlanta to Black Seventh-day Adventist community in Knoxville, Tennessee, from fields of relations between home places and yard spaces, to spaces between capitalist capture and hallowed grounds that speak of historical Black habitation. On this journey, we see faith communities making fellowship a reality amidst migrations away from origin countries and narrating cartographies of enduring sentimental value amidst the threat of displacement and dispossession. And yet, somewhat like our gathering tonight, this kind of gathering, church is present in both places, being made and made over via goat stew and dominoes, unseen hands that make, monetary offers that are refused, but don't refuse monetary offers, donate to the initiative there, and voices that encourage us to pause and remember rather than promise and redevelop. Sometimes it may just well be our spiritual relations and hallowed grounds are in each other and in the histories we were all in the midst of learning. Thank you.
Right through. Hello. Thank you very much, Professor Thomas, for that wonderful lecture. I want to invite those in the audience who have questions or may have questions to begin forming a line. We have 2 microphones, one here, one there. However, I will selfishly domineer the first question as I am here in front to ask a few things about how we might situate Black spirituality and Black evangelicalism as a whole. In your first book, for instance, you talk about a tension that exists in situating Black evangelicalism as somehow between sort of traditional Black mainline Protestant traditions, or a Black church that has been kind of papered over and made kind of homogeneous in how people think about it, and then evangelicalism, which is rarely qualified as white evangelicalism, which is why Black evangelicalism is that then therefore qualified and somehow stitched in between these two traditions. And you push against this idea that it is in between, rather that we should understand it as a different tradition or a different set of practices. So I'd wonder if you could expand on how you think about the landscape of Black spirituality as a whole, and how we might think about evangelicalism as a cultural formation shaping those spiritual life ways.
It's a wonderful question, and a dynamic one at that. Yes, I think we need more work on Black evangelicalism. I think because there's a way in which too often, and I encountered this struggle whenever I present on my research as a grad student and an early career professor. I remember I was at a conference in Ghana, and Reverend Dr. Jeremiah Wright was like, "Who are these people she's talking about?" Right? I think there's a way in which we assume mutual intelligibility amongst Black Christians, right? When Black Christianities are broad and myriad and distinctive, and we talk about Black spiritualities, we are not just talking about Black Christianity. We're talking about Black religion, which exceeds Christianity, right? Because that's not the only religion practiced by Black people, right? Black spiritualities would include various forms of Black Christianity. It would include various forms of Black Islam. It would include various forms of African indigenous religious traditions like Lukumi, which are also practiced by Black people in this country as well. So it's a very broad landscape view, right? When we think about Black spirituality. I think Black evangelicalism needs more scholarship because there are, for instance, I think, really important evangelists and missionary figures whose stories we don't speak of often enough, right? And it's interesting, I can tell what space I'm in when names start sounding familiar to people versus not. So if I mentioned the Nottage brothers, has anyone heard of the Nottage brothers before? No, right? So these are Afro-Bahamian missionary brothers, one of whom was actually very involved with the Moody Bible Institute, who found different Bible-believing churches in large cities, Detroit, Philadelphia. There are histories we don't yet know, right, that are known amongst evangelical practitioners and are known in Black evangelical parachurch spaces that are not known to the broader evangelical community, right? And sometimes name dropping is how I can orient myself to like where I am. I was at the AAR and I met, for instance, someone with the last name Hart. And I was like, "Are you from the Philadelphia Hearts?" He's like, "Yes, I'm from the Philadelphia." So there are also families, right? Migrant families, intergenerational migrant families who are Black brethren who have been in the United States as well, right? And so they have name recognition within certain Black evangelical circles. So, we need, I think, more histories, more biographies of the ways in which these figures found and made spaces within the landscape of American Christianity, the different views of American Christianity that Black evangelicals, whether from the Caribbean or whether African American, have of evangelicalism. Like, the South is known as like the Bible Belt, but to T. Michael Flowers, it was apostate, right? And it was apostate because for him, if you were a segregationist, you weren't a real Christian, right? He also didn't believe that Black churches were inherently Christian. So I would have interviews with people who would say, "Before I was a Christian, I was a Baptist," right? So people are working with different understandings of Christian identity, of Christian authenticity, of Christian landscape, right? Some people would say an interior joke in the DBC community would not be the South as the Bible Belt. They'd call it the Baptist Belt, right? And Baptist faith was understood to be particularly apostate, right? So these are, I think, perspectives that we need to know, right? Rather than assuming, one of the things that I've said, and it's a common line that I teach, is that hegemony or dominance does not preclude alternatives, right? We have an evangelicalism, like a meta-narrative, a popular story of evangelicalism that gets popularized by media, that gets popularized too much, I think, actually by polls, like polling data. Um, and that story has like a popular, dominance. But that is not US evangelicalism, right? US evangelicalism is far more complex than that, right? I think we also have to figure out who do we trust to tell those stories, right? I was a guest lecturer for theory and methods at Harvard Divinity School, where I worked before coming to Yale. And I had a student that was like, well, one of the challenges we have as evangelicals are people like you, which no offense, but you're a liberal researcher coming and rendering our religious movement. And I asked him, I said, what makes you think I'm not an evangelical? Right? This is an Asian American student. And he got quiet. And then I responded, I was like, I went to an evangelical primary school for 9 years. I was the captain of the Bible quiz team, right? You made an assumption, right, about my identity and where I come from because of where we are, right? You've not asked me anything specifically about my religious history. I don't identify as an evangelical now, but it is certainly, one of the things that members would say, you sound like an evangelical, your Bible is marked up, you know scripture, like you talk like an evangelical, right? Whereas when I first arrived and I was like, hey, I'm Presbyterian, they were like, we don't know if that's Christian, right? So I think also we also have tacit assumptions, right, on both sides of the divide, right, as evangelicals, as post-evangelicals, what it looks like, right? Who embodies that? Who's authentic? Who's real? Who's apostate? Who's an imposter or opposer? Who's an outsider? And I think that studying Black evangelicalism is useful because it brings some of those assumptions to the surface, right? In ways that I think are really important and positively reflective, if that answers your question.
Hi.
Hi.
So in one of my courses last semester, it was history and theory of anthropology.
Mm-hmm.
We ended the class with a question about the future of ethnographies.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering, as you were talking, how can we use, like in the future of ethnography, how can we use collaboration, and how can we use, I guess, sorry, I'm still formulating. How can we use this collaboration to change the way we think of ethnography and also change the way that we think about evangelicalism?
Mm-hmm.
And how can we use Kincraft and turn it into, I don't want to say like a national movement, but how can Kincraft become a little bit more widespread in other denominations of Christianity? So that we can kind of find a way to separate ourselves from this history of white supremacy and colonial imperialism, if that makes sense.
It all makes sense. Those are great questions. Yeah, I think the future of anthropology, I just taught an ethnographic methods class last semester. Ethnography is usually quite collaborative, right? You work in communities, you work with communities. They shape the questions you ask. You normally never end up doing what you think you're going to do. Originally, I was going to do research on Pentecostalism, and then I kind of got dragged back into evangelicalism. I thought I had escaped, and I'm back. Like, oh no. And so I think it is collaborative because you spend time with people, right? Like one of the things that I really appreciate is that, I'll look at poll data, but I'd rather talk to a person, if that makes sense. I'd rather sit in a pew or sit at a coffee shop and just hear someone talk about their lives or someone talk about their faith, right? And talk about their journey. And so I think that is just a really important skill. And I think we need just more of that to be better citizens. I think we need to listen deeply and more and learn about people's lives from their own lips than sort of tidy little stories that are made up, and that are more convenient, that are neater in a certain kind of way. I think that the future of ethnography is multimodal, right? I'm working with students who are trying to incorporate forms of AI into ethnography, people who are doing forms of digital mapping, right? A colleague of mine from New Mexico was just here, and her students are like doing using like some kind of cartographic software to map a cemetery, right? And they're using drones, right? So there's technology that's very much being written into, I think, ethnographic practices, which I'm terrified of because I'm not great with anything more than word or email. And so I think that there are a lot of opportunities, right, for thinking about kind of techno ethno. There's also some students that I've been working with here at Yale. Yale is like a very artsy, visual arts, performance arts oriented place. And I have several students who are artists who are thinking about different synergies between ethnography and dance and ethnography and illustration. There's a great series, I think it's University of Toronto, and it's I think it's like ethnography, and it does these graphic novels that are designed to be ethnographic. That tell stories of place or a social problem, but that are very visually oriented. And I think those can be really helpful in reaching different populations and groups and young people and sustaining interest more than having like a middle-aged lady ramble at you, right? And so I think that, yeah, I think there's also really interesting visual artistic mediums as well. And then one kind of future ethnographic practice I try to practice, or I've tried to start practicing, and it's very experimental. It makes me very deeply insecure, but I'll talk about it anyway. I decided to end my book on church arson with speculative fiction. I wanted to write past the arson event, and I wanted to think about Black church life and Black church ecclesiology is bigger than white supremacist violence, right? And I wanted to think about its mysteries, and I wanted to apply Adventist eschatology, right? Because Adventists think about the end of the world, right? They think about it often. They're called Adventists for a reason. And I couldn't find a medium to bring those things together. And so speculative fiction is the thing that I came to. And I came to it because I'm like, well, I talked to people and I let them speculate about who they thought was responsible for the church. I talk about capitalism, and capitalism gets to speculate. So I decided to give myself the same interpretive license, if you will. And so that is my way, is an anthropology of the future, ethnography of the future, which is just, I think it's very optimistic to assume that we have a future. I think it's optimistic to be Black in America and to assume that there are Black people and there's a Black church in the future. I think it's optimistic to be from Appalachia and to believe that Appalachia exists in the future, right? We have a vice president who's writing an elegy, for Appalachian populations. And Bell Hooks' elegy is different than Vance's elegy, I promise you, right? So I think just dreaming, right? I think literally like dream exercise. I think Christianity is an amazing utopian dream force, right? And too often, like, I don't know if there are any social like sci-fi heads in the crowd. We don't hear a lot about the Black church or churches in sci-fi. And I want to know why that is. Like, it's like some other religion, but somehow even Octavia Butler, Christianity, her dad was like a Baptist preacher, and it's like that gets set on fire and she creates Earthseed. So I think where evangelicalism can come together with ethnography is like creating and collaborating in collective dreaming exercises about the future, like taking what we've learned, taking what we're trying to move past, taking where we're trying to go. I think there's like, as someone who works at divinity schools, I've worked at Harvard, I work at Yale, like there's so much promise with young people, right? Young people in the faith, future ministers. The future is very green and green oriented. The future is very queer and queer oriented. The future is very, affirming, right? I've done interviews with activists, and they want churches that aren't locked up between Sundays. They want churches that use their spaces to house homeless people, because it's wasted resources, right? It's a wasting of resources. So I think that evangelical Christianity, and I think ethnography and ethnographers and evangelical Christians could collaborate in dreaming ecumenically, right? What is the ecumene? What is ecclesia now? What does it need to be, right? um, what kind of Christ are we worshiping, right? Into the next, generation. What have we learned from our mistakes, right? Because, we could talk about some of the mischaracterizations of evangelical Christianity, but there are some notable evangelical blunders, right? That have existed over the course of history. So what do we want the future to be in light of learning about those blunders, right? So yeah, I think there's some really, I love how Christianity makes me, I think the most Christian thing about me is that I hope for a future. I really do. I believe Christ will return, right? And it will be mysterious and inspiring and tremendous. And some people will recognize Christ and some won't, right? Some will be ready and some won't. The Christ that I write about in Speculative, the ending, I'm like, the new world will come, but we have to build it. He was a carpenter. He was a carpenter, baby. So there's no like the new world comes and we don't have to pick up some hammers and nails and get it built. That's not the Lord and Savior, I feel. I don't feel like that's the Adventist Lord and Savior. I don't feel like that's, so I think we also need to start thinking about the future, right? As well, right? So yeah, I hope that answered your questions, which were really beautiful.
It's really weird to be talking to you there when you're here. Just
I feel like Zordon from the Power Rangers. Just for those of you who know, I want to send some people on a mission.
thank you for your service today. Thank you for this gift. One thing that came up for me, and I recognize my question might be outside of the scope of your research, but you also then mentioned your personal connection and growing up in evangelicalism.
Yeah.
So I feel like you might have one or two things to provide. So the question I have is, you talk a lot about the role of genders, right, in very binary terms. And I'm wondering, is there a place and what is that role for queer, for transgendered, for non-binary individuals within Black, and I recognize the big umbrella of Black evangelicalism.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, in the space where I did my research, there was not a lot of space. I made a kind of, as you're a researcher, you kind of have to come up with your own ethical, moral compass. And so I made this like agreement with myself, one, that I wouldn't join the church, right? Even if I was asked to, which eventually I was. And then two, I made this point that I wouldn't discuss my like political beliefs like openly. But if I was directly asked what my political opinions were and beliefs were, that I would answer honestly, right? And just assume whatever the consequences of that honest answer would be. So in a young adult Bible study, I was like told, like, well, of course you don't believe in gay marriage. And I was like, no, I do. And it was like, she's not one of us, and so that was not a community where like I encountered anyone who was openly queer, anyone who was like openly LGBTQ. Right. And I definitely believe that doesn't mean that like just statistically speaking, they were there. Right. But that the way that gender was constructed and sexuality was constructed, it didn't create, at least institutionally, affirming spaces. Now, that doesn't mean they didn't exist at the level of everyday spirituality, but I was not invited into those spaces. That being said, I think that there are, there's like like you said, a broad umbrella of Black evangelicalism. And a colleague and I want to do a kind of collaborative ethnography looking at some of these sites of Black evangelicalism. Like I look at one community, but it'd be nice to look at impact, right? I had one student who's a grad student at Yale that was like, impact's not an evangelical movement. I'm like, some people who even debate the usage of the term to apply to them. So yeah, I suspect that there has to be, right? I don't think that evangelicalism is one thing. And I do think that one thing that my teaching has taught me, I remember teaching my last semester at Harvard Divinity School in 2022, was that? And I was teaching it might have even been the fall of 2021, but I was teaching my religion and race in the US class. And the class was filled, I would say probably half of the class was about 20, 25 students. Half of the class was young post-evangelical students, right? They were, I would say 80% of them were queer, right? And they were still at divinity school, right? Trying to figure out, right, what their relationship to evangelicalism was and what it would be, right? Trying to figure out if they could engineer spaces for themselves in and around evangelicalism, or if new movements were necessary. And there was just this like really, I would call it a really sensitive struggle, right, with evangelicalism, right? Where people were like, there are these exclusions I navigated that broke my heart, but these were the hands that held me up, right? And so imagine teaching like Go Tell It on the Mountain, right? And having these conversations, or reading, different things about disenchantment and re-enchantment. So I do know that divinity schools are places where queer evangelicals are trying to work out and think through their identity and the spaces that can be created and the ministries that can be created, or the analogs that can be created to bring in all of their whole selves, right? And so I'm just as interested as in those evangelical spaces I am in these divinity seminary spaces as well. And I would just say include them when you're thinking about where queer evangelicals are making their mark, making their voices be heard.
Selfishly, I have another question, which is, I think across the last three questions, you've highlighted, I think, the complexity of what evangelicalism is. And I think we are the Center for the Study of Evangelicalism. A thing that we get asked often is, aren't you afraid that you're going to make so broad of a definition of evangelicalism that it doesn't mean anything or include anyone? And I think in conversations that you and I have had, you've offered some really important ways for me to think about evangelicalism as a cultural formation. One way that you put it once, and I don't remember if you remember saying this, was that there's a kind, how do I think about where the evangelical in me is? Where evangelicalism is maybe what you described as a kind of psychic fundamentalism, or like a reflex to a certain kind of hard and fast understanding of religiosity, spirituality, and how that interprets into a politics. How do you think about what the thread is of evangelicalism across all these diverse formations that you're describing?
Yeah, I don't know. I think maybe being at a divinity school has spoiled me. And I think that depending on where it's cited, you could define, evangelicalism could be an ecclesiology, right? Evangelicalism could be a kin formation. Evangelicalism could be an eschaton, right? So I think that we want to create a definition, like what is this movement? And I think people are trying to find like movement inclusive definitions. But social movements are amorphous, they're co-occurring. The boundaries and definitions around them are constantly shifting, right? Especially around demographic change and transition. I think, I am interested, I'm already aware that I did research in 2008, 2009. So the community that I did, people have died, like that community doesn't exist anymore, right? So, there's also for me that the anthropologist in me is like, well, I got to go. If I want to stay a part of these conversations, I have to go back and do more research. I have to talk to more people. What is it now? Right? Like, 17 years of I'm different, right? My interviews go differently now that I'm middle-aged, I'm a mom, than they did when I was like 26 and like, looked like I was 12 and had never been married and had never, had a kid. So I think that when we're saying like we're defining evangelicalism, I also want to say like, okay, what about evangelicalism, right? Are we trying to define it demographically as a demographic movement, right? Because that's a definition, right? Are we trying to define it as a social and religious movement? Because that's a definition. Historians struggle with how to define evangelicalism. Is it a descendant of the first or the second Great Awakening? Is it a descendant of, neo-evangelicalism? Is it this, is it a descendant of this genealogy or that genealogy? Theologians have another time, right? So I would also say, like, be clear about the evangelicalism that you're invested in, that you want to define, right? Because I think there are many, right? And I think there are many because evangelicalism is a noun, but a lot of times we're using it adjectively, like as an adjective, right? And normally we're evangelical on the way to something else. There's a noun, right? We're using evangelical as a signifier, and we're not often clear of our signified, right? And I say that because I think, and I say this, Black evangelicalism has taught me this, right? That evangelicalism is a floating signifier, right? It depends. You ask a pollster, but one thing that's really, to me, a little eerie and maybe a little frightening is that if you ask most Americans off the street what an evangelical is, everyone has an answer. And they seem to be pretty sure of it. And if I were evangelical, I think I would be worried about that, right? That's something that, to me, has this signifier quality that sometimes stands for a signifier. When you ask people on the street, they are like, this is what it is, right? And so, yeah, I think evangelicalism, and I think depending on people are situated, has a signification problem, right? And it's just being clear about your signifieds, right? And what you're actually really invested in, right? And understanding that could be very different even within the same congregation, right? The congregation that I did my research, there was a really huge generation divide between older people and young adults. And within 5 or 6 years of the study, the majority of the young adults under the age of 35 had left the church, right? And I saw that happening while I was doing the research, right? Like, I could have very easily have been a congregational consultant and have been like, okay, you're going to lose your young people, and this is how, right? So yeah, I just think people I would say, like, think about your signified, the thing that you're really invested in, and defining evangelicalism around that, and not being afraid of cacophony and multiplicity. I think that's one challenge of, like, some of the hermeneutics of evangelicalism and literal, like, we want that thing, we want the consensus, we want the doctrinal. And I think we've had that. and I think that a different kind of hermeneutic or interpretive space could get farther. Like, what if you could gather definitions and hold them for a while, right? What if you let different constituencies define it for you and hold it for a while? Hold things in tension instead of trying to silence and then sort of unify, if that makes sense. And so I think that, and to me, as someone who grew up evangelical or someone as a scholar, that runs against my sensibilities. You're supposed to define for clarity, right? Like, this is what it is. This is the definition. But human groups and humanity is very complex. And I don't think social movements last by having very quick, tidy, answers, right? So I would say sometimes it might mean working against hermeneutic sensibilities, right? Literalist sensibilities, doctrinal sensibilities. Fundamentalism is a word, but it really is an orientation to knowledge project, right? It would require a bit of suspension, but I think a lot can be gained from that, right? Holding different definitions together.
Thank you so much, Professor Thomas. I want to return to your earlier discussion of kincraft and kinship, because kinship is an interesting sort of heuristic for thinking about ethnographic projects, insofar as, on the one hand, kinship is a way of creating relation, establishing intimacy, closing distances between people. At the same time, there is a lot of ethnographic work about how kinship is the vehicle of exploitation and power, and that the language of kinship has been used to, what is the way that you said today, to exert hegemony in certain ways. And so I was wondering, in the course of your fieldwork, did you navigate this double-edged sword of kinship? And if you encountered sort of either side of the blade, what did you do? How did you wrestle with these kinds of challenges?
That's a fantastic question. Yes, to all of that. I actually was teaching a chapter a couple weeks ago from by Mark Rifkin that was talking about kinship as a race-making project in the US. So yeah, I think that, kinship is a term. It can create notions of belonging and solidarity, but it also can create forms of exclusion and disenfranchisement, right? And we have to be clear that this community had this spiritual, assemblage of kinship terms, but that coexisted with heteronormative kinship idioms and ideologies as well. They're coexisting in the same space. I would say that in some instances, it's this other form of spiritual relationship. Like what I learned is a very basic thing, right? But I tell people I learned that heteronormativity is hard, right? For being all normalized, naturalized, sponsored by the state, all of that. The heteronormativity is actually really hard. It's not doing well, right? Like I'm divorced. The divorce rates in our country are over 50%. It's not a sexy project, I think, from critical theoretical perspective, but heteronormativity is hard. Spiritual kinship helps make heteronormativity possible, amongst other things, right? There are times though when you do get cut by the kinship blade. So when I started my fieldwork, I was, like I said, 26 years old. I was unmarried. I was dating at the time though. And so at one point, I think my then boyfriend came to visit, and there are questions about my sexuality, right? Like, well, are you sleeping with him? Where is he staying? You must be, mindful of your faith, and I remember my church dad being like, they're in their 20s, they're sleeping. Of course they're sleeping. There will be all these debates amongst, elders about what proper protocol would be. There are definitely times in which I think when we think about kinship, we think about relationship. We don't think about the identity-based subjectivities that are regulated by kinship, because kinship is an ethical system. It can be a regulatory matrix. So what kind of woman are you, right? I would definitely have people be like, well, you highly educated American women tend to be bad wives, right? Like, what kind of woman are you? Can you cook? Can you clean? Are you going to change your name? And so there was definitely times in which I felt like I was being regulated and kind of tossed back into my primary school soup a little bit, because there was a disciplining, like, are you the right kind or the wrong kind of woman? And what I would do is I had like a little group of grad school friends. My grad advisor, Susan McKinnon, was like the kinship person. And so after about the third time I called her house complaining, she was like, these are two of my students who are doing field work. One was in Toronto and one was in Iran. And we would complain about those moments, right? Where we felt like we were being disciplined or being like kind of, this is the way you're supposed to go. Like, and so it was like very challenging and very difficult because and all these claims would be contested. Like one time I was reprimanded for sitting between my church parents because they're a married couple and you shouldn't sit between them. Like you look like you're separating them, which I was so embarrassed by. So I was so new and so young, I cried. And then my church dad got really angry. He's like, you old folk, it became this thing, right? So it wasn't always like this harmonious kumbaya story. And if you read the book, you hear people talk about conflicts too that happen in the church, right? And even the notion that there was an ethnic split, that Corinthian Bible Chapel and Dixon Bible Chapel had actually split. Dixon was more Caribbean, Corinthian was more African American. It used to be part of one fellowship, and then it became two churches. And someone said, like a week before I left, that was about ethnic identity politics, right? And I was like, so yeah, the kinship coexists with conflict. Like kinship is not, I tell people it's not a kumbaya story, right? Kinship is very much about, when we look at classic studies of it, very much about arrangements of hierarchy and distillations of power and authority. It's an organizing matrix. And yeah, you do get cut by kinship, right? And you meet people who've been burned by it, right? You meet, divorcees, or you meet people who had never been married. You meet, one of my interviewers was talking about how he had several affairs, and he was like, evangelicals take sexual sin to be worse than the other sins, right? And that was him being cut by the gender, sexuality, matrix that heteronormativity resides within kinship in some places. So yeah, I was cut by kinship, and I think a lot of people are, because it's also a disciplining regimen too. I hope that answered your question, George. But I would take it, and then I would go bitch on the side with other colleagues and researchers who, would experience their own challenges and difficulties as well. Sometimes you get cut. My grad advisor would say, you're the instrument. When you bump up against something, or you offend someone, or you mess up, that's where you learn the boundaries. And if you're the instrument, yeah, like you're gonna get some knocks and bumps along the way.
Thank you very much for your insightful responses, Professor Thomas, and for your talk this evening. I also want to thank you all for coming out and joining us on this very cold evening. Thank you all so much. Let's give another thank you to Professor Thomas.